I'm Brandon Walsh. Hello, I'm the head of student programs in the Scholars Lab at the UVA Library. I am only here to hang out and be a plant. So I am here to introduce and enjoy the conversation about Ask Historians. I believe so this is we're gonna explain a little bit about the flipped format as a part of your, yeah, that might be good. But we're gonna go down the line and so I'll introduce the folks who are going to be talking. They'll talk a little bit about their work, the nature of the panel, and then the format for how we're going to go. So first we have Sarah Gilbert, Research Director for the Citizens and Technology Lab at Cornell University in the United States, Lisa Baer-Tsarfati at the University of Guelph, and then Daniel Howlett, PhD candidate at George Mason University. I will be here frantically monitoring the Zoom chat for anyone who's there. If you see any problems, you can feel free to DM me or drop it in the chat. And otherwise, I'll turn the show over to you all. Does that sound good?
Great. And Sarah, I believe we're going to have you go first. So whenever you want to talk about Reddit and Ask Historians.
Sure. So do we need to, so we have the flip format. We already, if you wanted to see our full presentations. So how are we doing this, Jan? Are we gonna, I can introduce Ask Historians and a little bit about Reddit, and then should I just launch right into sort of the TLDR of my talk for folks that have not had a chance to listen to the talk beforehand?
Go ahead, take all the time you want.
Okay.
Have a monopoly.
Great. Okay, so for folks who are not familiar with Ask Historians, it's a community on Reddit that was formed in 2011 and currently has just over 2 million subscribers. It is run by 50 moderators, although not all are active. With the user base, it tends to be young, white American men. And this is important to know because it shapes the community, but more about that in a little bit. There's also a couple of important things to know about Ask Historians. First is that it's got this really cool Flare system. So Flare is sort of this design feature on Reddit that allows you to add a little bit of extra information by somebody's name. And so on Ask Historians, we use that to denote people's area of expertise. And so the interesting thing about Flare and Ask Historians is that instead of being awarded based on your qualifications or your status as a historian or having a whatnot, it's earned through participation in the community. And so this is a really important thing because Ask Historians has this goal, public history, and it wants to be we want to be a very inclusive group. That's really important to the community itself. And so in making this Flare available to anybody with the expertise, it means that you don't have to have these sort of particular qualifications, and it's all based on sort of the evidence of your participation in the community. The other thing that's really cool about Ask Historians, again, is in the service of this public history mission, is that it's got this really extensive set of rules for asking or answering the questions that people ask on the community. And so these are really designed to make sure that the answers that people are getting are in depth, they're comprehensive, and grounded in historical practices. And so these rules are really actively enforced by the moderators. And so Ask Historians is different than the platform that it runs on, which is Reddit. So for those of you who are not super familiar with Reddit or avid Reddit users, it's a really popular content sharing website. It's typically ranked between 10 and 7 of the top sites in the US and has been kind of consistently ranked at that for a few years now. And so Reddit is actually, unlike a lot of other social media platforms where you follow individual people. So on Twitter, you'll follow people, people will follow you. Same with Facebook, you friend them, Instagram. Reddit is actually comprised of interest-based communities called subreddits. And so you follow those instead. Another interesting thing about Reddit is that participation is largely pseudonymous. So you pick a username. People rarely participate with their real names, unlike other, social media websites like Facebook or Twitter, or I suppose it's technically X now, but I refuse. The other thing is that content is submitted by its users. So Anybody with a Reddit account can submit anything they want. This includes text, photos, videos, anything you want, pretty much. Well, actually, probably just those three things. And so this typically ends up, because content is submitted by the users, the content that is shared tends to reflect the interests and values of this user base. And like AskHistorians, the user base of Reddit also tends to be young, white, male, and American. And so the bread and butter really of Reddit is its voting system. So basically how this works is that as long as you're signed in, you have the power to upvote or downvote. And so upvoting ends up promoting content to various feeds. So you have your own home feed, which is comprised of subreddits, content from subreddits that you subscribe to. And then there's sort of a universal home feed that everybody called are popular now, that's comprised of popular stuff from all across Reddit, including subreddits that you don't necessarily subscribe to. So basically, the more people like something, the more likely it is to be pushed into one of these feeds and that people will see it. It'll rise to the top of these sort of various pages. And then downvoting has the opposite effect. So if you don't like something, you can downvote it, and that ends up obfuscating it from view. So it not only sort of pushes it down in this queue, but will literally, especially in the comments, it will literally collapse it so that you have to click on it if you want to see it. Also, historically, there's been an emphasis on free speech. This is something that's like very common across a lot of early online platforms, online communities that were really founded on this kind of techno-libertarian view of like what freedom on the internet should be. And the idea is that it's supposed to be this, this free place where everybody can speak. And on Reddit, the idea is that the upvotes, that it should be more democratic. The people should be deciding what content gets promoted and devoted based on what they like or what they don't like. And there's this sort of pushback against moderation. So you contrast that with AskHistorians, which is really has a lot of rules that are really actively enforced. And in this way, it ends up working quite a bit differently than Reddit, because that kind of ethos of let the upvotes decide doesn't work so well in AskHistorians, where a lot of the people don't really know, what's right or what's wrong, and will upvote things that are interesting to them or that seem truthy and that feel right, which often ends up reflecting a lot of sort of, just inaccuracies or things that people want to be true about the world. Oh, there's Ari. I didn't see him. Sorry, I just got distracted by the cat. So in the context of that, my paper was really the goal of my paper. I'll try to give like a kind of a brief TLDR. It's going to be long, or sorry, I shouldn't say TLDR is like a Redditism for too long didn't read. So really the goal of my paper was showing how intersectional feminism can be used as a framework for moderation in order to create, fairer and more equitable spaces online, particularly in epistemic communities like AskHistorians, which, as I mentioned, is this public history website, one of the largest ones on the internet, where it's really important for people to go and learn about history. For a lot of people, it's really the only place that they have on Reddit that they can go and trust. So the way that we apply the rules and the way that we set up the rules is really important for that. Just like a super quick primer on intersectional feminism states that aspects of people's identities create unique combinations of discrimination, and that this is impacted at different kind of levels of power. So it manifests differently within people's interpersonal relationships, within smaller communities, and also within larger systems. And so in order to use intersectional feminism as this frame, I told two stories that highlight some of the challenges that AskHistorians moderators face in creating these fair and equitable spaces for all users, particularly Indigenous users in the community. So the first story is about the development of policy that would account for Indigenous knowledge. And the other one is about how proactive moderation, so providing answers to questions before they're asked, essentially, can help counter colonialist mindsets. So the first story is really, in short, about how some of AskHistorians rules, the way that they're written now, actually end up prohibiting traditional forms of Indigenous knowledge. So one of the things that we are constrained by is that because it's this pseudonymous platform, we don't know who people are. And so this, because we have this, like all we have is basically like what people can kind of prove through either like evidence or sources or whatever, we end up like relying really heavily on like written forms of information. And one of the things that we prohibit is anecdotes, because we don't know who's saying what. And this helps us, again, like create this sort of more trustworthy space. It's not unlike Wikipedia. Wikipedia also has similar rules. But, anecdotes also prevents people from sharing, form like knowledge that they've learned, through family members or elders in their community. And so what ends up happening is that like this traditional form of knowledge, it's like valid and meaningful and like it knowledge in Indigenous communities ends up getting silenced when people try to use that as evidence in Ask Historians. And so a while back in 2016, two moderators, one Indigenous moderator, one non-Indigenous moderator, tried to build a policy that would account for this gap. But it ended up, it didn't end up doing anything. The policy didn't end up going anywhere. It really ended up falling flat, and it's probably a good thing because the way that the policy was written is that it would have ended up making things worse. Like it would have ended up basically making people, Indigenous people, have to prove their own source of knowledge and their own with like by using like extractive forms of information. Like so, like it's I don't know if I'm doing it justice explaining it here now, but essentially, like what would have happened would have been worse if we had ended up like kind of going along with this policy. And then the second story is about a time in 2020 when two Indigenous moderators decided that they wanted to throw shade at this proclamation that the Trump administration put out in advance of Columbus Day by writing an Indigenous Peoples Day post on the same day. And so basically this was to highlight the atrocities of Columbus because a lot of people don't know about it. And so the community response was really mixed. A lot of people, continued to insist that Columbus was actually like awesome and that colonialism was super great. And so, we should be really happy for it. And then we're also using this voting system that I mentioned earlier to actually hide comments from the moderators, particularly when they were talking about reparation. And also using the reporting system so people can report rule violations in Reddit as kind of tone policing, like so reporting them as being incivil if their tone switched like even slightly. So there were all of this like, within this, sort of educational space, there was all this oppression happening. And this was mostly on the labor of like the two mods who had written this, who were engaging in the conversations, even though in the back end, there were some other mods, providing a bit of social support, removing rule violating comments and things like this. But really it was up to these two moderators to do this. But even though there was a lot of this like, negativity at the time, there were also a lot of really positive comments from it, like people talking about how much they learned from it, how much they appreciated the moderators' efforts and how much they had learned from them. And then every Indigenous Peoples Day, we reposted again. And it doesn't necessarily get a whole lot of upvotes, but it doesn't get that same kind of negative attention now. It tends to inspire a lot of really fruitful conversations that like, critically like take a more critical look at Columbus and colonialism and things like that. So it kind of, there's this sort of dichotomy here between like community responses between the really good and the really bad. And so then I use these two in the talk, I use these two stories to highlight how power, particularly at these different layers of power, affect moderation. So within like interpersonal relationships, sometimes these can be, empowering through social support, but they can also be disempowering. So for example, during the policy development, the Indigenous moderator felt like it was really challenging for him to sort of push back against, some of the things that the other moderator, the white moderator, had wanted to do. She's a white woman, super influential person within the moderation team and in the community. So it was really challenging for him to kind of confront that power. And so ended up just kind of letting this policy die rather than, actually developing a policy that would account for Indigenous knowledge because of these complications within this intersectional complications of power at this interpersonal level. So then at the community level, we can also think about power relationships between moderators and community members. Typically, moderators have a lot of power relative to users in the sense that they can control what users can post by removing them or approving posts. And sometimes this can actually inadvertently hurt marginalized people, particularly when we're talking about violations of this anecdote policy. If people are using or knowledge from their elders, and then they're getting that removed, that's a harmful application of moderation power. That's disempowering to marginalized folks is through the application of our policy. But sometimes it can actually be empowering. So creating space for marginalized perspectives, by removing crappy answers, by creating safer spaces for people to participate, to make sure that they're free from bigotry and abuse. We saw all those bigoted comments, but we removed all those. The audience did not see any of those talking about how amazing Columbus was, or how, we should all be super happy for colonialism. Those were in violation of the rules. And people, some of those we ended up, I'd have to go back and actually look at that thread to see how many of those or which ones we actually removed. But a lot of them we removed to kind of, again, to sort of create this a safer space for people where they might feel comfortable or ideally feel more comfortable contributing. And then at the systemic level, there's this power of epistemic communities and proactive moderation in countering some of these, this systemic sort of disempowerment that, how people are using historical narratives to disempower particular groups, how we can sort of shift that conversation through this proactive moderation, through making these posts, through providing this information to people, sometimes even before they're asking, so that these dominant narratives, these dominant questions that are kind of constantly coming from this, young white male user base, so that we get this diversity in perspectives and questions, through acting sort of more proactively there. So in the end, I argue that an intersectional lens is really helpful in understanding both how power affects what we see in online communities like AskHistorians, and how accounting for power moderation can upend how we think about it. So it's not just about removals, it's not just about censorship, to ensure that moderation not only fights oppression, but also can be empowering. So Dan, I don't know who we want to pass it over to next or what the format is going to be, but that's sort of the main summary of my talking points.
All right, well, we can keep the order from the recorded panel and go to Lisa.
Sure. Awesome. Thank you. I always get super engaged when Sarah's talking about her research, because it's just yeah, tell me more about intersectional feminism and power dynamics. So thank you everyone for joining us for our session. It's been a few weeks since Sarah, Dan, and I recorded our panel, and it's probably been a few days since many of you watched the paper. My paper talked about the AskHistorians digital conference that I ran in 2021 in collaboration with our conference organizing panel at AskHistorians. And so just to give you an overview of what that paper kind of talked about, I'll just kind of go through the idea of creating more inclusive and accessible digital events. The COVID-19 pandemic really pushed us to rethink how we engaged with each other and with the public. We saw a rapid shift to digital platforms for scholarly activities. Initially, these were seen as temporary solutions, but these events have shown us some lasting benefits, especially in terms of inclusivity, equity, and accessibility. Traditional academic conferences, while valuable, come with a host of challenges. They're often expensive, logistically difficult, and exclude many scholars, particularly those early in their careers, from underfunded institutions or with disabilities. In contrast, digital platforms can remove these barriers making participation more feasible and equitable. A great example of this is the Ask Historians Digital Conference, or the AHDC, which took place on Reddit, Remo, and Gather in 2020 and 2021. This conference was free and open to anyone with internet access, allowing a much wider audience to participate, also sort of demonstrating those values that we hold dear at Ask Historians about making things inclusive and equitable and accessible. It maintained the rigor of traditional conferences, but was far more inclusive, welcoming early career researchers and scholars from marginalized backgrounds. For instance, in 2020, the AHDC featured 42 speakers and moderators across 8 panels and 2 roundtables with significant gender and racial diversity. One specific highlight was the inclusion of diverse voices. 50% of the participants identified as women, and there was notable representation from Indigenous, Asian, and Latinx communities. In 2021, this diversity further increased, showcasing speakers from 5 continents and 9 time zones, emphasizing the global reach and inclusivity of digital platforms. My paper argues that digital spaces shouldn't be seen as just stopgap solutions, but as transformative venues for academic engagement. Drawing also from Black feminist theory, particularly intersectionality, it's clear that we need to rethink academic spaces to address systemic inequities. Digital platforms can help us create dialogues that are more equitable and socially responsible. The AHDC serves as a case study in this regard. It demonstrated how digital platforms could be leveraged to create more inclusive academic environments. The conference's success shows that digital events can be just as valuable as in-person ones, if not more so, in fostering diverse and rich scholarly exchanges. By embracing digital platforms, we can make academic engagement more inclusive and accessible. My paper challenges us to rethink our approach to scholarly events and recognize the potential of digital spaces to democratize knowledge dissemination. So a couple things that didn't get covered in the paper because it was really long and I didn't want to go any longer than I already did, but maybe something to think about as we move into Q&A were the ways that we leveraged digital platforms to really kind of tackle inclusion and accessibility for all kinds of traditionally marginalized groups. The organizing committee wanted to be accessible and inclusive, not just for racially marginalized scholars and people whose voices were traditionally marginalized, but also for neurodiverse scholars, for people who maybe suffer from anxiety, and for whom networking events are particularly fraught. So we utilized the platform Gather as a networking tool, which was really fun. And one of the things that our organizing committee came up with was color coding everybody's little avatar's hair, so that when people showed up to the networking events, it was like your hair color would signal to people how comfortable you were with being approached and talked to. So if you were a super anxious person, you could say I prefer to be the one approaching you because that makes me more comfortable. Or if you were someone who would prefer to just kind of lurk and listen to conversations, your hair color would signal that to people. And it was something that our organizing committee really wanted to take into consideration because we wanted the conference to be really inclusive for all kinds of participants. And it's things like that that you can kind of leverage digital platforms for. So yeah, stuff like that maybe we can ponder and discuss more. And I will throw it back to you, Dan.
Thanks, Lisa. So my paper talked about one of our rules on Ask Historians, which we call the 20-year rule. We don't allow discussions of current events. We don't want modern politics because that's just going to turn messy. Already it's tricky to moderate historical things. Modern politics is just going to get worse. There's plenty of other subreddits that will direct people to when they have modern political questions. And we use the 20-year rule as just arbitrary. If it happened in the last 20 years, it doesn't count. It's inclusive for New Year's brings in, so 2004, it's totally valid in the Ask Historians canon now. That does upset people who are over the age of 20 and realize things, like when we got asked about Avril Lavigne's Skater Boy. People were really upset in the comments that this was now a historical question. But we did get an answer on how it reflected high school dynamics in 2002. So we can get really cool questions. But something that the moderators have noticed a lot, and we'd often comment on, is that when things happen in the news, we tend to get an influx of questions related to it. So I started looking at this in 2021 when the US was withdrawing from Afghanistan. And the New York Times headlines and Ask Historians posts just had similarities. So one of these was in April when they were talking about the plans for removing the US troops. Suddenly the top post of the day was about when the Taliban took over Afghanistan, what happened to pastimes. When the US left, there was a question of how did Afghanistan go from being relatively stable 50, 60 years ago to the constantly devolving mess it is today? And the New York Times headline was, the Afghan military was built over 20 years. How did it collapse so quickly? And this happens for a lot of different events. We've seen happen with Russia and Ukraine, Israel and Palestine. They tend to be foreign policy related, but I want to track that. So I just did a quick case study on the 2021 questions that included Afghanistan, just to see what was happening. And over the course of the year, there were 162 questions with Afghanistan in it. We get probably 100 to 125 questions per day. So this is actually a really small amount of questions being asked on Ask Historians. But almost all of them were in relation to current events and what was going on. So I looked at it to see, like, how else is this comparison happening? How much engagement are these posts getting? And when looking at the data set, you would see that the days where Afghanistan had the highest scores in Google News interest were the days we got the most individual questions about Afghanistan. And this happened throughout 2021. And what was really interesting was that looking at which posts got attention, because we do depend on our users to answer questions, and we do have flared users who specialize in topics, usually there'd be one post that got a ton of attention and thousands of upvotes, which means thousands of people read it or at least clicked the like button. And then there'd be a lot of smaller questions with similar language that would go unanswered. So it did make our answer rate for these questions look like we weren't getting answers on these posts, but a lot of them came in floods. So there was information being shared about the history of mostly the Soviets. People were making comparisons to the USSR withdrawal to the American withdrawal. There were a few people who started asking about Vietnam in that same context. So I noticed that it was kind of like this rabbit hole that people could go down. They start looking at what was happening in 2021. They ask about the Soviet Union leaving Afghanistan. Then you have some people who go a little bit further and make a comparison to Vietnam as a slightly different topic. And then there were some users who, we have a flair called Interesting Inquirer, which means it's someone who has a history of asking interesting questions. Those users were asking more unique questions related to Afghanistan at the same time, but not really tied to the news events like the Soviet Union withdrawal. So the example I pulled was that someone during the same time frame as the US is withdrawing, as it's covering the news, someone asked, what about slavery in Afghanistan in the 1920s? And a lot of these users will comment in their posts, they'll add some reference to reading news stories, or they'll say, I was reading Wikipedia because of what's going on in the news, and I had this question. And I think the main thing we should take away as historians and humanities scholars is that if someone's trying to ask about the world and their first stop is Wikipedia, their next stop is Reddit, where are they going next? And that could be a concerning pathline if we're not there to intersect that. Because we have seen content from like 4chan and 8chan cross over into Reddit spaces. Their history is so much worse in what they allow. We can talk about bad actors and history in the Q&A. But people are going to these free sources that are online. They're not reading our books. They're not going to our conferences. they're looking to places like Reddit to understand what's going on in the world. And one type of post that we've had on very rare occasion is meta post. So most meta posts on Ask Historians are posts about the rules and about the subreddit, sometimes the history of the subreddit. But on rare occasion, whenever there's a huge influx of questions, we might have a mega thread to just gather questions on a subject, or we'll have usually a moderator, or I'll give another example of a user who asked about writing a meta post, just writing a summary of historical context. So in 2020 and 2021, we had two. One was on the George Floyd and police brutality, and it was a post just summarizing some of the history of racialized violence against Black people by police. And then we had one in 2021 on the Atlanta area shootings that were, I'm not sure how many people remember, but someone shot up several spas, and that person claimed that it was not racially motivated. But what ended up happening is that when we had our meta post saying that this was racist violence against Asian people, users were pushing back saying, well, the shooter didn't say it was racist. So our post had this long history that Lisa was responsible for writing about how sexualization of Asian women played into this narrative that this motivated the shooter. Our users weren't accepting of that. So there is a difference in what type of current events they want historicized. And we can see that in the types of questions that get asked. So we got lots of reports on those, even saying like, this topic's less than 20 years old, why are you allowing it? But no one complains when we have the, like, well, what happened when the Soviets withdrew type of question, which is clearly making a historical connection as well. We did get some great feedback on those posts of people saying like, this helped me make sense of my own identity too. Like people were happy with that, talking about the intersectionality and understanding the history that they maybe weren't aware of, but were experiencing. And one meta post that I think is really significant is that we had a meta on January 6, 2021, when the US Capitol was attacked by an insurrection. That user was a flared user who wrote it. They reached out to us and said, hey, this is something unprecedented. Can I write something up for Ask Historians? And we allowed it. We don't always allow solicited materials like this, but they were able to write up a history of political violence and elections about 30 minutes before the US Capitol was secured by the police, and it was up and had thousands of people reading it. So we are also able to give this very fast response to news events through Ask Historians. And people were commenting saying, thanks for all the help. This really helped put this in context. Now I understand what's going on. It was really great to see that response given how fast it came up. And I've been looking at it now because the long July of 2024 happened mostly after we recorded our panel. I've been looking at how the election has been going through historical questions. We've had questions about President Biden, and the questions have been like, well, did Reagan have Alzheimer's while he was in office? We've had questions about how people reacted to the shooting of Reagan and the attempted assassination attempt. We had a question even about the Chevron case that changed federal regulations, which I thought was a really interesting one to show up on Ask Historians. But the really important part, I think, is that after the Supreme Court decided that former presidents do get some level of immunity, we saw a huge influx of a specific genre of questions. And these are just some of the ones that came up. Was the German population okay with the Enabling Acts of 1933? Was there a German equivalent of California as Germany descended into fascism in the 1930s? After the failed coup of 1923, how long did it take for there to be widespread awareness that Germany was in danger of descending into fascism? Did Hitler pardon supporters of his that participated in the beer hall putsch when he obtained power? And are there good examples in history of countries that had a rise in fascist ideology but was halted before full-blown fascism? That's a pretty concerning trend of questions when people are watching the news and thinking, this is something I need to know about. And like these posts came with, I'm asking for a friend from another country. Like, has democracy ever been in danger before? Was one of our most popular ones last month. So people are going to history and the humanities to try to understand what's going on. And it's up to us to really meet them there, even though Sarah has a paper which starts off with a quote from a moderator saying, that I moderate one of the largest public forums on the internet, and it's on a cesspool of a website. And Reddit really is a bit of a cesspool, but that's where people are looking for information to understand the world around them. They're trying to put current events into context using history. And I think that's something we should be trying to think about, like, what is our responsibility with these really, frankly, gross spaces online? Ask Historians is nice and clean. We've cleaned it up a bit. But I think that's a question we have to ask ourselves. So with those summaries, I guess we'll move on to Q&A.